The morning started like any other, with a golden haze stretching over the acres of my family's farm, a kind of peaceful, almost sacred calm you only find when the world is just waking up. I was standing by the old oak tree, the one my great-grandfather planted when he first claimed this land, when I saw her, Karen. She was marching straight through my crops, highlighter yellow sneakers flashing under floral yoga pants, dragging a battered clipboard behind her like a sword of entitlement. Before I could even call out, she jammed a crooked, "For Sale, Community Property" sign into my front pasture with a grunt of effort, wiped her hands dramatically like she'd done something noble, and then waved at me like I was some clueless tourist trespassing on her lawn. Hello friends, if you new here then don't forget to hit subscribe button, and if you like then hit the like button also, and don't forget to tell me in the comments where you from watching this video. I blinked, thinking I must be hallucinating from too much sun, but no, she was already snapping photos on her phone, angling to capture my barn, the fields, the whole legacy of my family. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be an annoying neighbor problem, it was war. Karen didn't bother with introductions. She stomped across the muddy field, almost slipping twice but managing to keep her death grip on the clipboard as she barked out, "Excuse me, you're in violation of neighborhood zoning." I stared at her, still holding a pitchfork, still not fully believing this was happening. She jabbed the clipboard toward my chest. "This land," she said, with the conviction of a toddler pretending to be a cop, "has been absorbed into the Willow Creek Homeowners Association by majority vote. As acting president, I'm ordering you to vacate immediately, or we'll proceed with legal acquisition." I let the silence stretch so long even the crows above stopped calling. "Lady," I finally said, "this farm's been in my family for over 100 years. It's older than your entire HOA. It's older than your manicure." Karen's eyes narrowed into furious little slits. She jabbed the sign again for emphasis, like that piece of dollar store plastic had the power of a judge's gavel. Thinking maybe she was confused, I walked her over to the boundary marker, a worn stone inscribed with the farm's founding date, 1897. Karen stared at it, pursed her lips, and declared, "Fake." Then, without hesitation, she whipped out a roll of caution tape from her tote bag and started wrapping my mailbox like it was a crime scene. A little crowd had gathered at the road, some HOA members in matching shirts that said, "Community Pride," and a few nosy neighbors filming with their phones. Karen posed dramatically next to her taped-up crime scene and announced, "This farm is being reclaimed for the community good. You'll be getting an eviction notice soon." One of her minions handed out flyers titled, "New Community Park and Rec Center Coming Soon," with a badly photoshopped image of my barn replaced by a swimming pool. The absolute nerve would have been almost impressive if it weren't so utterly insane. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my dad, who had spent his entire life working this land until his hands were a map of every storm and season he'd endured. We read through the ridiculous HOA violation letters Karen had started sending, each one more absurd than the last. Apparently, I owed $250 for non-regulation fencing, $500 for unauthorized livestock, our cows, and a staggering $10,000 new member initiation fee. My dad just laughed a low, gruff laugh that said he'd seen worse bullies in his day. "Son," he said, handing me another envelope stuffed with fake fines, "they picked the wrong farm." The next morning, I wasn't surprised to find more signs plastered across the farm's front gate, one reading, "Private HOA Property. Trespassers will be prosecuted." Karen was back too, this time with a folding chair, a megaphone, and a large thermos labeled, "Not Wine," in big pink letters. She perched herself proudly like a queen on a throne, blasting warnings at anyone driving by that my land was pending reassignment to the community. She even tried to get a few passing joggers to sign a fake petition she claimed would speed up the transition. The problem was, Karen wasn't working alone anymore. Her antics had stirred up the more gullible parts of the neighborhood, the ones who didn't know the farm's history and thought maybe there was something to her claims. They started showing up at the gate, asking when the park would open, some even asking if they could volunteer for demolition day. One particularly bold man pulled into the driveway with a measuring tape, saying he was planning out the future pickleball courts. He left pretty quickly once my cattle dog, Jake, nipped his heels for stepping where he didn't belong. I realized if I didn't act soon, this thing was going to spiral. Karen was creating a false narrative so loud and ridiculous that some people were starting to believe it simply because no one would dare lie that boldly. Right? Wrong. Karen would, and Karen did. She set up a lemonade stand right by the farm entrance, handing out free "Welcome to Willow Creek Community Farm" brochures. On the front was a smiling cartoon version of Karen herself, standing next to cartoon goats and a big sign that said, "Future Home of the HOA Community Center." I called the county office that afternoon, and after a few rounds of confused transfers, finally spoke to someone in the zoning department. They confirmed what I already knew: my farm was zoned as agricultural land, private property, and protected under county and state law. The HOA had no jurisdiction over it whatsoever. None. Zilch. Zero. But as the woman on the phone warned, sometimes it's not about the facts, it's about how much trouble people like that can cause before they're stopped. That night, as the sun dropped behind the hills and the fields turned to gold, I sat on the porch and looked at the land my great-grandfather had claimed with little more than a mule and a dream. Karen thought she could steal that with a neon sign and a stack of fake fines. She had no idea who she was dealing with. This wasn't just a farm, this was a legacy. This was my family's blood, sweat, and backbone carved into the earth itself. She wanted a fight, she was going to get a war. And tomorrow, the first shot would be fired. The morning after Karen's dramatic lemonade stand stunt, I woke up to the sound of tires crunching on gravel. I looked out the window and saw a beige sedan creeping up my long driveway, a giant magnet stuck to the side of the door reading "Willow Creek HOA Enforcement Division" in sloppy vinyl letters. Two men in ill-fitting polo shirts stepped out, one already scribbling into a notebook like he was drafting criminal charges against my corn. I watched in disbelief as they strutted up to the house like they had a warrant. One of them, a tall, wiry guy with sunglasses too big for his face, cleared his throat and announced, "We're here to issue formal HOA citations for noncompliance with neighborhood beautification standards." I didn't even get a chance to laugh before they handed me a thick wad of papers that looked like they had been printed from a busted inkjet printer. The violations were ludicrous: unauthorized rustic aesthetic, obsolete agricultural infrastructure, and my personal favorite, unlicensed wildlife presence, referring to the hawks that hunted near my fields. While I stood there flipping through the nonsense, Karen herself came marching down the road, arms pumping like a furious mall walker, dragging behind her a gaggle of clipboard-carrying neighbors. She pointed dramatically at my barn, then at my cow pasture, rattling off fake infractions like an auctioneer: illegal structures, improper land use, environmental hazards. The neighbors scribbled eagerly, barely hiding their glee at the drama unfolding before them. One guy, holding a Starbucks cup the size of a traffic cone, even nodded solemnly when Karen declared, "My rooster is a threat to community peace." At first, I figured I'd just ignore the clowns and let them wear themselves out, but Karen had other plans. That afternoon, I found more signs posted along the road: pending community renovation project, future home of Willow Creek Park. She had gone to a local print shop and gotten professional banners made, with happy cartoon families frolicking where my wheat fields currently stood. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. Worse, she had set up folding tables at the edge of my property where HOA members were collecting donations for the Park Development Fund, complete with a big glass jar already stuffed with $20 bills. I called the sheriff's department, explaining that trespassers were soliciting money on my private property. But by the time a deputy finally arrived, Karen had moved the tables a few inches onto the public sidewalk, just enough to claim they weren't trespassing anymore. She smiled at the deputy with an angelic expression, talking about bringing the community together and preserving green space for future generations. The deputy, clearly recognizing the crazy radiating off her like heat waves, advised me to start documenting everything for a formal harassment complaint. He tipped his hat and muttered, "You've got yourself a real piece of work there," before driving off. By the next morning, the madness had escalated. Drones buzzed overhead, swooping low over my fields and barn, operated by some of Karen's more tech-savvy minions. They claimed they were documenting community assets for inventory purposes. I documented them right back with my camera, noting every time they crossed onto my airspace. It was like living in a bad spy movie directed by lunatics. Jake, my cattle dog, hated the drones even more than I did. He spent hours charging across the yard, barking furiously at the mechanical invaders until they buzzed off in terror. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a pair of surveyors showed up, claiming to be from the county planning office. They wore reflective vests and carried clipboards, which would have looked official if they hadn't been smoking cigarettes and arguing about football stats the entire time. They marched straight into my vegetable garden, jamming fluorescent survey stakes into the earth as they argued about whether the 49ers had any shot at the playoffs. When I asked for identification, they flashed fake badges so obviously homemade that one of them still had visible Sharpie marker smudges. I called the real county office, who quickly confirmed they hadn't sent anyone. When I told the fake surveyors I was dialing the sheriff, they yanked up their stakes and sprinted for their rusted pickup, peeling out so fast they kicked up a cloud of dust big enough to hide an elephant. At dinner, my dad was so furious he slammed his fork down on the table hard enough to make the plates jump. "We survived dust bowls, wars, recessions, and floods," he growled. "And now we gotta survive an HOA president with a Facebook law degree." He wasn't wrong. Karen had declared open war on a farm that had weathered more hardships than she had manicures, and she was too self-righteous to realize how badly outgunned she was. That night, I sat on the porch flipping through old land deeds, maps, and tax records. The farm had been in continuous operation since 1897. The boundaries hadn't changed once. There was no legal way the HOA could claim it, no zoning change, no annexation, no backdoor city ordinance. Karen was blowing smoke, but smoke could still choke you if you weren't careful. I needed a plan. I needed to hit back, not just legally but strategically, before she poisoned enough minds to turn the whole town against us. The first step was hiring a lawyer who knew land use laws like the back of his hand. That's when I called Mr. Dandridge, a legend around these parts for taking down crooked developers and saving historic farms. When I explained what was happening, he actually laughed, a deep, rumbling, "You've got to be kidding me" laugh, and promised to come by in the morning. "Let's see how she likes a real legal notice taped to her golf cart," he said. The second step was documenting everything: the fake violations, the drones, the harassment, the fraudulent fundraising. I spent the whole evening uploading videos, photos, and detailed written reports to a shared drive Mr. Dandridge could access. If Karen wanted a paperwork war, I was going to drown her in it. The final step was playing the long game. Karen believed she could bully, lie, and intimidate her way into ownership because that's how she ruled the HOA. But my family had survived storms that cracked the heavens and floods that swallowed whole fields. We didn't break. We adapted. We endured. Karen thought this was a sprint. She didn't realize she was running a marathon against a family bred for stubborn, brutal endurance. As the stars spread out over the fields, I leaned back in my chair, feeling the deep thrum of the land under my boots. This farm wasn't just soil and fences, it was every birth, every harvest, every laugh, and every heartbreak my family had ever lived. Karen might think a few fake fines and a neon sign could erase that, but she was about to find out exactly how wrong she was. The battle for the farm had only just begun, and by the time it was over, Karen was going to wish she'd stayed on her side of the property line. The next morning came with a sense of tension so thick it felt like the heavy mist rolling over the field. I was sipping my coffee on the porch when the first sign of a new attack arrived. A beat-up sedan crawled down the road and stopped in front of the farm. Out stepped Karen, flanked by a man wearing a blazer 2 sizes too big and carrying a worn-out leather briefcase. She strutted like she was leading a charge, waving an official-looking document over her head like a trophy. Jake, sitting at my feet, growled low and deep in his throat as she marched straight up to the gate, slapped the paper onto the post, and turned to her small cheering squad gathered behind her. They clapped like she had just personally conquered a foreign land. I waited until she finished her little performance before walking down to see what fresh nonsense she had cooked up. The document was laughable. It was a corrected deed claiming that after a secret vote by the HOA board, the land had been declared communal property for the betterment of Willow Creek. It was signed, stamped, and even embossed with a shiny fake seal that looked suspiciously like it had come from a craft store. The best part? They had printed it on pink paper. I chuckled under my breath, realizing she actually thought this would scare me into handing over my home. Karen caught my smirk and jabbed a finger toward my chest, declaring, "If you refuse to vacate, we will pursue immediate legal action. You are unlawfully occupying community land." I leaned over the gate just enough so she had to step back and said calmly, "Karen, this farm has been in my family since before your great-grandma was born. You're standing on a legacy that's about to stomp you flatter than that ridiculous clipboard you keep waving around." Karen turned bright red, like a kettle about to blow, and stormed off, shouting into her phone about calling the real authorities. Within hours, more chaos unfolded. Official-looking inspectors from different departments started showing up. First came the environmental health inspector, who insisted he needed to test my soil for hazardous community waste. Then a noise compliance officer appeared, demanding to measure my rooster's crowing decibel levels at dawn. When a man with a clipboard and a badge labeled Historic Preservation Society tried to tell me my barn was an unregistered landmark, I realized the level of crazy had reached new heights. I asked each of them for identification, real credentials, anything that actually tied them to legitimate agencies. None of them could produce anything other than the same HOA letterhead with different made-up titles. Each encounter only fueled my determination. I meticulously recorded every conversation, filmed every inspection attempt, and logged every interaction. Mr. Dandridge had advised me to gather everything, even the most minor infractions, to build an ironclad harassment case. And that's when I noticed something even worse. Hidden among the trees, tucked under the eaves of my barn, and even camouflaged against fence posts, were small blinking cameras. Karen had planted surveillance equipment all over my property without permission, trying to catch me in some imaginary wrongdoing. I spent the afternoon tearing them down one by one, throwing each cheap plastic spy eye into a pile that grew higher and higher. Each little blinking light was another nail in the coffin for Karen's case. That evening, Mr. Dandridge arrived, wearing a cowboy hat and carrying a folder so thick it looked like a phone book. He smiled as he set it down on my kitchen table and said, "This, my friend, is what victory looks like." He had compiled every deed, every tax record, every zoning map, and every relevant statute confirming the farm's untouchable status. He even had copies of county and state designations that recognized my land as a protected agricultural heritage site. If Karen thought she could bully her way into a hostile takeover, she had just picked a fight with a nuclear bomb of legal authority. But that wasn't the end of the surprises. As we reviewed the evidence, Dandridge leaned back in his chair and said, "There's more. The Agricultural Commissioner's office has taken an interest. Turns out they've been looking for a site to designate as a historic farming landmark." My ears perked up. A landmark status would mean even stronger legal protections, plus grant funding for restoration and maintenance. It would essentially make the farm bulletproof to petty HOA harassment forever. Karen's scheme wasn't just doomed, it was about to backfire so spectacularly it would go down in local legend. The next morning, I decided it was time to start hitting back. I printed enlarged copies of my official deeds and posted them right next to every one of Karen's fake signs. I added big arrows pointing to them and stapled a copy of the law that stated unauthorized removal of official documents was a criminal offense. I even hung a giant banner over the barn door reading, "Private family property established 1897, trespassers will be prosecuted." Jake posed under the sign for a photo that I promptly shared across every community Facebook group within 20 miles, complete with a caption explaining the real history of the farm and exposing Karen's fraudulent claims. By noon, the post had gone viral in town. Comments flooded in with neighbors expressing outrage, disbelief, and in some cases, absolute ridicule for Karen's antics. Someone photoshopped her lemonade stand into a medieval guillotine cartoon. Another neighbor offered to host a Karen repellent fundraising party, complete with plastic flamingos and lawn gnomes dressed as security guards. Even better, local reporters started sniffing around, a TV van parked discreetly down the street, hoping to catch Karen in action. And action was coming, because despite the mountain of evidence against her, Karen wasn't backing down. That evening, I spotted her and a small army of HOA zealots meeting at the community clubhouse, waving around printed blueprints labeled Future Willow Creek Park. They had sketched out a fantasy land, complete with a swimming pool, pickleball courts, a cafe, and a historic garden where my vegetable patch currently thrived. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so disturbingly deranged. Watching her rally the troops with passionate speeches about taking back what belonged to the people, I realized something chilling. Karen believed every word she said. She wasn't just lying to manipulate others. She had lied so much that she believed her own delusions, and that made her even more dangerous. She wasn't going to quit because someone told her to. She was going to have to be stopped, hard and publicly, before she dragged more people into her spiral. That night, as I sat back on the porch watching the farmhouse lights flicker warm against the darkening sky, I made up my mind. It wasn't enough to defend anymore. It was time to go on offense. Karen wanted a showdown. I was going to give her one. And when it was over, she was going to regret the day she ever set foot on my family's soil. The real battle for the heart of this farm was about to begin, and this time, I wasn't pulling any punches. The next morning felt different, like the air itself was bracing for a fight. I could see a crowd starting to gather down at the end of the road, just outside the community clubhouse. Karen had sent out flyers, emails, and even social media invites announcing a community celebration and land reclamation ceremony. I stared at the flyer someone had left taped to my mailbox, marveling at the sheer stupidity of it all. According to Karen's delusional event plans, today was the day the farm would officially be welcomed into the Willow Creek family, complete with a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a barbecue, and speeches from so-called community leaders. Never mind that the farm wasn't theirs to claim, never mind that everything they were doing was wildly illegal. Karen didn't live in the world of facts anymore, she lived in the world of whatever reality she could shout the loudest. By the time I got down the driveway, I counted nearly 50 people standing around in folding chairs, munching on donuts and chatting like this was some sort of county fair. A big white tent had been set up just over the property line on the public sidewalk, festooned with balloons and banners that read, "New Horizons for Willow Creek" and "Reclaiming Our Green Space." Karen stood at the front of it all, wearing a bright blue sash that said, "Madam President," and holding an oversized pair of scissors she clearly intended to use for her fantasy ribbon cutting. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. Before she could begin her speech, a convoy of official vehicles came rumbling down the road, 3 black SUVs with county plates, a sheriff's cruiser, and at the very end, a truck bearing the seal of the State Agricultural Commissioner's office. They parked right in the middle of Karen's makeshift celebration, cutting the crowd in two like Moses parting the Red Sea. For a brief moment, everything went utterly silent. Karen froze with the scissors in midair, a smile frozen on her face so tightly it looked painful. Then the officers stepped out, stern and no-nonsense, and started walking straight toward her. The lead officer, a broad-shouldered man in a crisp uniform, addressed Karen without even bothering with a microphone. His voice carried over the crowd with the finality of a thunderclap. He announced that the farm was protected agricultural property, owned privately under historical land use laws, and that any attempt to claim trespass or alter it was a criminal offense. He informed Karen that her unauthorized surveillance, false documents, and fraudulent fundraising efforts were now part of an active criminal investigation. As he spoke, another officer unrolled a long sheet of paper listing the charges and potential penalties. The list was so long it actually flapped a little in the breeze like a scroll in an old cartoon. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She tried to interrupt, sputtering about community needs and majority rights, but the officer shut her down cold. He said simply, "You do not have the right to override property laws because you held a potluck." As Karen stammered and shrieked about injustice, 2 deputies calmly walked up and handcuffed her. The crowd gasped. Phones came out recording, and someone in the back started clapping slowly until it turned into a full-on cheer. Karen's posse scattered almost instantly, some trying to pretend they had never heard of her, others literally sprinting back to their cars. A few stood there awkwardly, caught between loyalty and self-preservation, but when Karen began shrieking about suing everyone and demanding they rescue her, even they backed away. The officers loaded her into the cruiser as she continued to rant about eminent domain and community rights, though no one was listening anymore. As the sheriff's car pulled away, dragging the self-proclaimed Queen of Willow Creek off to face reality for the first time in months, I let out a slow breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But it wasn't over yet. Mr. Dandridge arrived just minutes later, carrying a thick envelope full of documents. He had filed a civil lawsuit against Karen personally and against the HOA collectively for harassment, slander, trespassing, attempted fraud, and emotional distress. Copies of the lawsuits were served right there on the remaining board members, who looked like they might melt into the asphalt under the weight of it all. Dandridge was grinning like a shark as he explained the damages we were seeking, which included not just legal fees, but compensation for every single disruption and false accusation Karen had caused. As he delivered the papers, he whispered loud enough for several people to hear, "Congratulations, folks, you just became famous for all the wrong reasons." Later that afternoon, news trucks began arriving, local reporters clamored to interview anyone who would speak, and by nightfall, video clips of Karen's arrest were circulating online. Someone even made a meme out of her getting cuffed, with the caption, "Community property." Karen, you mean community service. Hashtags like #Farmgate, #Karen Reclaimed, and #OULand exploded across social media. It was beautiful chaos, the kind that plants seeds of permanent humiliation. But the cherry on top came when I got a call from the state agricultural commissioner himself. He congratulated me on handling the situation with remarkable restraint and informed me that my farm had been officially designated a historical agricultural landmark. Not only was my property now legally bulletproof against future HOA nonsense, but I was also eligible for grants to restore some of the older structures and expand the educational outreach program my family had talked about for years. The farm was no longer just surviving, it was thriving in ways my ancestors could have only dreamed about. As the sun set that evening, painting the fields in deep gold and crimson, my dad sat beside me on the porch. He held up a glass of sweet tea and a silent toast, and I clinked my glass against his with a smile. We watched the lights of the community clubhouse flicker dimly in the distance, much quieter now, stripped of its self-importance. Karen was gone, her influence shattered, and her ridiculous dream of turning our heritage into a public splash pad had drowned under the weight of the law, common sense, and good old-fashioned stubbornness. For the first time in what felt like forever, the farm was at peace again. The earth beneath my boots felt solid, sure, timeless. Karen had underestimated what this land meant, not just to my family but to everyone who understood that history isn't something you can bulldoze for a barbecue pit. She had thought she could take it with lies, banners, and clipboards. She learned the hard way that some roots run too deep to ever be pulled up by someone as shallow as her. The battle was over, the farm stood stronger than ever, and we were just getting started. The morning after Karen's grand downfall dawned bright and clear, a fitting contrast to the chaos she had tried to bring down on the farm. There was a fresh energy in the air, almost as if the land itself was breathing easier now that her nonsense had been cleared away. I stood by the front gate, looking over the rows of crops that stretched into the horizon, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace I hadn't known for months. The farm was ours again, not that it had ever truly been in danger, but still, winning the battle so decisively made it feel even sweeter. It wasn't just a victory for my family, it was a statement, a reminder that heritage, hard work, and the stubborn endurance of generations couldn't be wiped away by one entitled woman with a megaphone and a delusion. We decided it was time for a real celebration, one that honored the farm and the community that had rallied behind us once the truth came out. I made a few calls, and before long, plans were set in motion for the first annual Willow Creek Harvest Festival. Flyers went up at local stores, schools, and churches, announcing a day of games, food, music, and history, all taking place right here on the farm that had survived everything from droughts to cars. Volunteers poured in, neighbors brought homemade pies, local musicians offered to play for free, and even the fire department agreed to set up a dunk tank for charity. Someone jokingly suggested we make a cardboard cutout of Karen for the dunk tank target, and while we all laughed, we wisely decided to keep things a little more neighborly. Mostly, the festival day arrived with the kind of perfect weather you could never plan, only pray for. The fields were lined with hay bales, the old tractors were polished and lined up for kids to climb on, and the barn had been cleaned out and strung with fairy lights. Families poured in, laughing, eating, exploring, and learning about the history of the farm. We set up a table covered in old black and white photographs showing the farm through the decades, from my great-grandfather standing proud with his first harvest to pictures of my father teaching me how to drive a tractor at 8 years old. People walked through, reading the stories, understanding that this was more than just land, it was life woven into every inch of soil and wood. At noon, I stood up on a makeshift stage built from old pallets and thanked everyone for coming. I spoke about the importance of history, of respecting the past while building the future, and how community means more than just property lines and HOA fees. It means standing together when it counts. I didn't mention Karen by name, but everyone knew what I meant when I said, some tried to claim what wasn't theirs, but roots like these run deeper than lies. The applause was loud, warm, and full of genuine support. Just when I thought the day couldn't get any better, a black SUV pulled up, and out stepped the state agricultural commissioner himself. He presented my family with a beautiful plaque officially designating our farm as a state agricultural heritage landmark. The plaque gleamed in the sun as he read a short speech about perseverance, history, and the importance of preserving places like ours for future generations. My dad stood next to me, trying and failing to hide the proud tears welling up in his eyes. I didn't bother hiding mine. It wasn't just about winning anymore, it was about honoring every ancestor who had broken ground, planted seeds, fought storms, and lived and died on this land so that we could stand here today. The festival went on into the evening, the golden light stretching across the fields as kids ran, laughing through the rows of corn, chasing each other and hiding among the stalks. At one point, I caught sight of Jake, our loyal cattle dog, leading a parade of toddlers around the farm like he was their appointed tour guide. I saw neighbors who had barely spoken before now sharing food, trading stories, and making plans for next year's harvest. It was everything a community should be, not the toxic mess Karen had tried to force, but something real, something earned. Later, as the stars began to appear one by one in the deepening sky, the last surprise of the day unfolded. I overheard two women talking near the old well, their voices low and amused. Curious, I wandered closer and caught the tail end of their conversation. Karen's house had officially sold that morning, the buyer paying in cash. At first, it had been a mystery who would buy a property so freshly tainted by scandal, but then the truth slipped out like a perfect punchline. The local goat rescue nonprofit had bought it. They planned to turn the house into a rehabilitation center for rescued goats, giving them a place to heal, graze, and live out their days in peace. I couldn't stop laughing. It was so fitting, it almost felt scripted. The woman who had tried to turn our legacy into a playground would now have her former domain filled with head-butting goats and bleeding freedom. Karma, it seemed, had a sense of humor. As the last cars pulled away and the lights slowly dimmed, I walked back out to the edge of the field. I stood there in the cool night air, looking up at the stars, feeling the weight of everything that had happened settle deep in my chest. We had been tested, pushed harder than I ever thought we would be, but we came through stronger, more rooted than ever. Karen had tried to steal our home with lies and arrogance, but in the end, all she had really done was bring us together, remind us of who we were and who we would always be. The farm was more than land, it was memory, sacrifice, love, and pride. It was every sunrise my great-grandfather had watched, every storm my grandfather had endured, every field my father had plowed, and every promise I made to the future. It was a heartbeat that echoed across generations. No one could take that away, not now, not ever. I turned back toward the house, the windows glowing warmly against the dark, and smiled. The farm was safe, the legacy was secured, and the story of what we had fought for would be told for years to come. And as for Karen, well, somewhere not too far away, there was a herd of goats waiting to introduce her to the real meaning of community property.